Good evening and a warm welcome to everyone here from Talking Films Online, TFO for short. TFO was founded almost on a whim by Professor Nikhila and myself in June 2020 during the lockdown. It is a group of film scholars, researchers, students, teachers, and anyone passionate about cinema. We are happy that we have been able to sustain this forum thanks to people like you who log in every Saturday to participate in the discussions. It has been our practice to invite people to select and lead the discussion of the chosen film, which we watch in our own time and place. We have also held film festivals such as East European, Iranian, Women's Cinema, and others. We have also held retrospectives of Kelly Reichardt and Adur Gopalakrishnan. In the month of June each year, to celebrate our anniversary, we hold a smartphone short film making contest for students and also organize a lecture series in collaboration with colleges and university departments. Today's discussion will be led by Bhageshri Trivedi. Bhageshri is an assistant professor of English at the Faculty of Law, the Maharaja Sayajirao University of Baroda, Vadodara. She has recently submitted her PhD thesis, and her research interests span gender studies and region studies with a focus on Gujarat. She finds the emerging area of decoloniality exciting, and her research has been published in international and national journals. Her multilingual background allows her to pursue translation and peek into a wide range of art and literature. She has grown up on a steady diet of parallel cinema and regional Indian cinema and is eager to connect with fellow film connoisseurs. Welcome to you, Bhageshri, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Geeta ma'am, for the introduction. And I'm happy to finally be a part of the discussion group. While I joined it a while back, for some or the other reason, I couldn't participate in the discussions, but I have been following the YouTube videos and it has been quite engaging. Today, I'm going to discuss a Marathi movie, which is titled MAATI. This is a directorial debut of Chitra Palekar, a director whom those who follow parallel cinema in India might know well. I have made a little PowerPoint presentation and I would like to share the same, where I have put in screenshots and pointers that will help lead the discussion. I hope the screen is visible to all.
Yes, it is. It is.
All right. Yes. So, MAATI, the subtitle in English is A Gravekeeper's Tale, but I will come back to the title in Marathi in a while. Formally, it was released in the year 2007. At a glance, this is based on a short story called Bayan by Mahashweta Devi. Mahashweta Devi, of course, is an author who needs no introduction, but for those who may not be following literature, I would like to say that she is one of the most celebrated fiction writers, Bengali fiction writers of India. One who often dealt with social realities and social issues. The plot of the movie and the plot of the story are quite similar to each other. So those of you who have read the story might have found the echoes in the movie. This, as I said, is a directorial debut of Chitra Palekar. Chitra Palekar has known to be a good writer and producer for a lot of parallel cinema as well as good television content in India. This is her first film as a director. This film is also notable for being the debut in Marathi cinema of a very well-known actor, Nandita Das. This originally premiered at the Toronto Film Festival in 2006. And for this, Nandita Das bagged the Best Actress Award by the Maharashtra State Film Awards, as well as the Chhatrapati Shantaram Award for her performance. Now, before we get into the movie, I would just like to talk about the plot at a glance for all those who have not been able to see it yet. So in terms of the story, like I said, Mahashweta Devi's plot and the movie are quite similar to each other. This story is about the protagonist, who is Chandi Dasi. Chandi Dasi has inherited her ancestral work of keeping children's graves. So as we know, within Hindu communities, children are often buried and not cremated. And her ancestral duty, the family she's born into, are involved in the occupation of burying and keeping children's graves. Now, Chandidasi, therefore, is a fearless woman. Of course, she is born in one of the lowly castes living on the outskirts of the village. One day, she meets a man passing by her hamlet, and the two fall in love. This man in question, whose character is played by the well-known actor, is someone who's also in the gray market of smuggling bones or finding unclaimed dead bodies of animals and humans and smuggling them in the gray market of medicine and health and doctors and surgeons. The two of them fall in love. They have a son. However, as soon as Chandi has a son, life begins to shift for her. She begins to start questioning her role as a gravekeeper of children and often faces a dilemma between her duties as a mother and her duties as a gravekeeper. And in the process, many things happen. Once an epidemic hits all the villages within her hamlet and around her, and certain people start casting aspersions on Chandi actually feeling some sort of affection or feeling motherhood towards dead children. And seeing this, they start calling her a witch or a demoness. Chandi does not accept this until one day she decides to give up her work altogether because she's constantly torn between her two roles. However, at the end of this, what happens is her own husband starts looking at her guilt at leaving her occupation, leaving her with a great psychological dilemma and a kind of psychosis. And one fine day, he himself declares her to have turned into a demoness. Because of this, Chandi is cast outside the village entirely as a pariah, and she lives in a makeshift hut outside the bounds of the village and is cast into this identity of a demoness whom nobody can look at, otherwise she can kill people just by her looks, a kind of Medusa. However, Chandi's son is taken away by her husband. He marries again, and when Chandi's son finds his father talking to her once, he questions her, why did you talk to a demoness? That is when the husband tells the son that she's actually your mother. That is how the story gradually unfolds. And eventually something happens at the end of the movie. There is about to be a train accident by a gang of smugglers who have arranged a bunch of logs, etc., on the train tracks to cause a train accident so that then the passengers can be robbed. But Chandi stops this from happening. In the process, she sacrifices her own life, and the government announces a bravery award. After the government announces this award, and they come to the village to question that who was this woman, as she's not alive anymore, whom should we give her award to? And that is when Chandi's son, he claims or identifies her as not a demoness but his mother, and this is the scene where the movie ends. So this is in general the plot for all those who have not been able to follow the movie or the story yet. Now I'll get into the discussion itself. So before we actually get into the discussion of what the movie offers to us, I would just like to get some things out of the way, which are the elephants in the room. For those of us who have watched the movie, there are some things that may have felt a little uncomfortable, especially if you have a taste for good cinema. So I'd just like to talk about that and get it out of the way. So one thing is with respect to the writing, at points the movie does seem to have certain abrupt plot developments. For example, we never know why the character of the husband suddenly experiences this moral guilt and ends up telling the entire story of Chandi, who's now a demoness, being his son's birth mother, whereas she has been cast as a lav. Lav is the Marathi word for the demoness, which chudel, whatever you want to call it. And what leads to this sudden change of heart is something that's not sufficiently developed in the narration of the movie. Then if we come to pacing or editing, we find that certain scenes are stretched maybe longer than they could have been, and certain scenes such as the child smiling at the end of a shot, or a superfluous action happening at the end or inside a scene, which doesn't seem to lend anything really to the content. In terms of cinematography, this is what a lot of critics said for the movie, that its picture qualities actually has the echoes of the 80s parallel cinema. So, the Akroshes and Thoda Sa Rumani Ho Jaye or Gaman and all those movies, which focused more on content, where cinema as an art was still developing. It has that kind of a feel, this movie, and therefore almost feels whimsical in its narration at times. So it feels less like a 2007 movie and more like maybe something from the 80s. And in terms of direction, some scenes tend to have a little bit of an emotional outburst and acting, which seems to be a little more stilted, a little more like theater. So these are certain things that may have stopped us from engaging with the content of the movie. So I would like to begin the discussion by conceding that yes, it may not be the best piece of visual narration, but yet it has a lot to offer, which we shall now get into. So this is going to be the flow of my discussion. In the beginning, I would like to discuss a combination of what is common between the short story itself and the movie, which more or less has the same narration as the short story. So what are the themes and issues that the story raises, as well as how are cinematic devices being used to raise, enhance, or shine a light on these themes and issues. And then towards the end of the discussion, I would like to move on to something else, which is the question of what does the adaptation bring to the table? What is the new interpretive layer that we can find when the short story Bayan becomes the movie MAATI? So beginning with the first part of the discussion, two things that are remarkable for me were the use of sound and space. The movie starts with this peculiar, almost eerie, sinister kind of background music. The landscape that you see in the visuals is also vast and barren with almost no life that you can see around. And I feel that this kind of music lends to creating a foregrounding or introducing us to the central character, who is going to be this demon-like woman with matted hair and clad in a red kind of robe or sari, and just walking around with nothing in her hands. So the music kinds of lends an interpretation to the narration itself, which is that what you're going to see on the screen now is something you should be afraid of. There's an ominous background music. Even the entry of the central character, Chandi, played by Nandita Das, is something which is quite sinister, because she carries this aluminium kind of pot, a kind of water pot in her hand, and she's constantly hitting it with something. Now, this is a way, because she is a complete outcast. She's also somebody everyone is afraid to look at, because they might die or be harmed in some way by her evil eye. So she has to announce herself wherever she's going so that people can disperse before she reaches. So there is a screenshot on the left hand side of the screen. You can see this is one of the first shots of Chandi in the movie. You can see a very hazy visual of a red color and what she's holding, what she's banging the stick against. So this is her introduction. So she's introduced to the audience again as somebody who's sinister and ominous. You also have in the background calls of the vulture and such. So I think what the sound initially does is to foreground the idea of a taboo. A taboo being something that we must be away from, we must not cast our eyes on. Of course, the call of the vulture is associated with death, which is associated with Chandi, who is a gravekeeper, which again is a huge taboo subject in so-called civilized human societies. So the music works to foreground the idea of the taboo. And then from the music, we go to the next aspect of foregrounding, which is the use of space. Now, in terms of the use of space, what you see on the right-hand side on the top, that screenshot from the movie, That is one of the first shots of Chandi that we see. So look at it. We can barely see the facial features. It is a completely barren landscape with just a lone tree and this makeshift hut. And we only see this figure clad in red. Even her stance is something which is not a kind of stance that seems to be coached or cultivated or belonging to civilized spaces, but and look at the landscape around her as well. It is dry and it is barren at best. Also, there is a flag, a red colored rag kind of flying as a flag on top of her hut, which kind of signals danger quite literally if we use the color red as a metaphor. And on the other hand, in the bottom left, you have a screenshot from the movie. This is her grown-up child who's now living with her husband and his stepmother, the lady whom the husband has married again. This is the son's first encounter with this woman walking by. Right now, for the son, this woman is simply a witch and nothing else. So look at his facial expressions. Look at how he's hiding behind the bushes and looking at her. Now, I believe that this is the way the audience is being cast by the cinematic medium. Okay, as we say, the camera is the narrator when it comes to movies. And what the narrator is doing is casting us in this position where we gaze at Chandi again from a distance. So the camera is creating this space between us and the protagonist. So how it is locating our gaze is again to look at her from the social lens, okay, or the linguistic lens that she is a demoness, she is a witch, and all the associations that come with it. So this distancing in terms of space, this hidden gaze at something which is taboo is what the cinematic device is establishing. So again, foregrounding the idea of a taboo through space. And this use of space continues in the entire movie. So the most obvious use of or significance of space is how Chandi's social position is depicted through her being located or spaced away from the center of the village. So she is located right at the outskirts, even outside the boundaries of the village. Another interesting use of space is on the left-hand bottom, you can see there is a screenshot. This is a screenshot of the village school. Now, on the village school, as usual, what it has done is there is a list of important dates and events that happened on that day. So on the top, we can see 15th August 1947, and it is written in Marathi, but it reads Bharatacha Swatantriya Din. That is the Independence Day. Then it is 26th January 1950, Prajasattak Din. And at the bottom is written 1955 Asprushya Nivaran Kaida, that is the law against untouchability. Now, this is used to create an irony because we know that although on the board, in the constitution, in the law, this is a regulation that has come up, but this has not translated in the space of the village itself. This again is shown merely by visual narration, because when you actually see the children sitting in the schools, they are again sitting in segregated spaces. So Chandi's son, who belongs to a lower caste, is sitting segregated from the remaining children in the schoolroom. So we see on one hand the child writing this on the board, and on the other hand the material reality of the school environment itself. Now on the right hand side you have a screenshot where Chandi's son is explaining to his father, played by Atul Kulkarni. He's explaining to him what they were taught in school, and he's telling his father there is something called the Constitution. And in the process, he says a very pertinent line. The line he says is that, oh, there's something like the Constitution, and that Constitution is in Delhi. Now, this seems to be a very innocent line of how the child has understood what's delivered in the school, but this has its own implications and ramifications. What it means is that once again reinforces what's there on the left-hand side, which is that the Constitution has come in Delhi, but it has not percolated to every section and every layer of the society of this free country yet. So this village, this hamlet is a social space and is also a political space, which is far removed from all the progress, the changes in questions of identity, and the so-called modernity that has reached at the capital of the independent country. So we can see that space in this movie is not just a physical visual, or it's not just a bare location, but it is something that is layered with a lot of symbolic meanings. And this is something I will be developing further into the discussion. Now, from a discussion of physical spaces, the movie moves on to the exploration of spaces as metaphorical. I have chosen to look at the question of identity in the movie as something which is highly metaphorical, which is also looked at in spatial terms. So now, when we listen to the plot of the short story by Mahashweta Devi, or when we look at the movie, the first obvious themes we see are the existence of superstition in rural areas, and of course, the question of gender discrimination and caste discrimination. So my strategy in this discussion is to not repeat or reiterate what I think all of us may have already felt reading or watching the movie. So what I'm going to take up in the discussion is those ideas which stand a little away from these obvious themes, which would be a part of general discussions. So I think the movie really problematizes the question of identity. First of all, both Chandi, the protagonist, and her son, both of them are entities or individuals who face a question of identity. As the movie begins, now the narration in the movie is in a sort of flashback system. So it begins when we look at Chandi, who has already become a Dayan or a witch. And then in flashback, we come to know her entire story. And then we come back into the present and lead to the final climax of the train accident, right? So, in the beginning of the movie, we see Chandi and her son both feeling a sense of lack of belonging anywhere. Chandi's son, of course, because he's living with a stepmother, also facing caste segregation wherever he goes in the social spaces of the village. And Chandi herself has now become a witch, of course, facing complete segregation. So, I believe that to go a little bit into the conceptual idea of identity, when you identify something, when you name something, the very act of naming is a way of delimiting something into a certain space. So the question of identity is related to the question of space, to my mind. What I mean by it is this, that meaning is like a spectrum. But when you choose to name something, you are identifying that, okay, this is the space, that semantic space associated with this word. Okay, so that is what I mean by the act of delimitation. Now, those of you who know Ferdinand de Saussure and what he said about meaning created by difference between the words, etc., would know what I'm saying. But even in general, I think we all understand, okay, that for example, if I choose to call something a table, then in the entire spectrum of meaning of objects on which you can keep something, which can be a table, it can be a bench, it can be a podium, etc., when I assign the word table to an object, I'm delimiting its space within the spectrum of meaning, right? So the very act of naming is an act of delimitation. Now, when we go from common words like table to words which designate social concepts, for example, a mother, a father, okay, or a goddess, a witch, then the act of naming is doing something more. And what it is doing is that it is not just delimiting an entity within semantic space, that is the space of meaning, but it is also delimiting an entity within your psychological space, because the act of naming is creating certain specific associations with it, right? So for example, if I would say goddess versus demoness, okay, both the namings have certain specific social, psychological, cultural meanings associated with them. So that is the delimitation that is happening, right? So that is why I say on the first point of the slide that the idea of the taboo is a semantic construct that is externalized in space. What do I mean by this is that when I am calling Chandi in the Marathi movie, the word is Lao. Okay, Lao means Diane, witch, menace, etc. So when I am calling Chandi a Lao, I am not only ascribing a social identity to her, I am not only ascribing these psychological fears and anxieties in the people living in that space associated with Chandi, but I'm also relegating her to a specific physical space, which is beyond the boundaries of the village itself, right? So this is what I mean by a taboo, which is a semantic, meaning-driven idea, turning into a psychological and social zone, and finally externalizing, expressing itself as a certain physical space, right? So that is what I mean by the second point, that the act of naming is an act of delimiting an entity, and delimiting is a spatial temporal act, right? Here I'm going to focus on it as a spatial act, right? So first, I've already talked about identity and caste. So when I say that naming, giving something an identity, is creating a certain space for it, we see its most obvious expression in the question of caste. Especially if we see traditional zones that were created in rural areas, okay, in any town or hamlet or village, there would be specific zones assigned to which community or caste can reside where, and often the untouchables would be those living in the at the boundaries and the outermost circle of a village, right? So caste is one question where we can very obviously see how naming is associated or is externalized into physical space or creation of zones, right? When Chandi is put exactly outside the village, there is a song which plays in the background of the film. And in that song, there is a line which I have quoted here at the end, which says, "Maay orakhila kon," that is, who would know me, who would recognize me. She is facing a complete loss of identity, right? And this identity is reclaimed only at the very end, when, as I said in the beginning, when I discussed the plot, when her child claims, when she gets the bravery award from the government, that she was not allowed, she was not a demoness, she was my mother, so you must give the award to me. And that is the shot which I have placed in the bottom left of this slide. But this shot is something that we can all spend a few seconds looking at, because this shot captures everything I've said so far about the act of naming. Look at how the act of naming is a declarative event, right? What do we mean by a declarative event? Is something which creates an immediate change in physical circumstances, okay? The use of language which has immediate effect on our material circumstances. So this is what I mean, that the moment you name something, you are actually creating psychological, social, and also physical ramifications for it. And when we continue looking at the question of identity across the movie, we see a lot of ironic reversals happening. So now on the slide, you can see two visuals. On the left-hand side, you see the scene where the government officers have come to ask people of the village that who was this woman who laid her life to stop the train from meeting an accident. Nobody is ready to identify the woman. Even the husband, Atul Kulkarni, refuses to do so because he is afraid to be ostracized by his village community. So here we have a Havaldar, okay, a government officer, saying that, well, if she did not have any other identity, at least she must be having a caste. And the word he uses is Jati or Jat, right? So this was the prescribed, traditional, customary way of assigning identities in the traditional society, something that was untouched by the contact with modernity that happens in the 19th and 20th century. So on one hand, we have independent India defining itself as a modern nation, okay? And this modernity, one of the first important gestures this modernity does is to break out of customary group identities and enter into the realm of individual identity. A modern world where it does not matter where you come from, what your traditional occupation was, but it only matters what you're capable of and where you can go. But we see this irony where here's a government officer who is talking about identifying a woman by her caste. And contrast on the right is a screenshot of Chandi. She has just returned from digging and burying in the grave the daughter of one of her own friends. And when she's returning from there, the friend and her family, in a fit of rage and desperation, They see, because Chandi herself was a feeding mother when this happened. So she used to have breast milk ooze out even while she was doing her work, which was for her own child. Now, the family of her friend sees this and they accuse her that, oh, you have breast milk oozing out when you look at dead children, which means you are a demoness. Now, here's the exact shot where Chandi listens to this and she looks at all of them and she uses the word Adani for all of them. So the word Adani in Marathi quite literally means someone who's uneducated, ignorant. So we see that education is something that we often associate with modernity, but we have on the left a person who seems to represent this modern world, but whose thinking is very much still rooted into the customary forms of identity. And on the right hand side, we see this so-called uneducated woman who has a much more sorted, much more rational approach to life and experience around her, right? Another reversal that we see throughout the story is the identity of Chandi and the identity of the Lao or the demoness. And this is a very interesting reversal, because when you think of the idea of a demoness, you think of her as somebody who's wild, who's somebody who's not afraid of anything, rather who instills fear in others. Uh, on the other hand, what happens here is when you see Nandita Das playing the character of Chandi, she is shown to be something who's fearless, someone who's fearless. Okay, there's also this kind of a song which she and Atul Kulkarni share, that Mala konacha bhev nai, I am not afraid of anybody. You know, she's up at night, she's driving away the wolves from the graves, which is quite a dangerous task even for men, but she's not afraid of that. She has a very strong sense of identity. That's what we see in the first half. So even when people around her question her for her work, she is quite confident and out there about it, that she's proud of her work, that she's taking forward the ancestors' legacy. But at the same time, it is when she's in the role of Chandi that she loses her motherly identity, when the village pushes her into a new identity. Now, what is that new identity? They say that you are a demoness. But when we see Chandi turning into this Lao, we see that this fearless woman has suddenly become a highly fearful woman. Because now she is afraid of even killing her own child by casting her so-called evil eye upon him. We see that she is completely devoid of a sense of self. And that is a screenshot I've placed on the right-hand side. She's looking at herself in the mirror. This shot is again quite poignant because we see her inability to recognize herself or her inability to identify what are the characteristics, either physical, psychological, or emotional, that she should be associating herself with, because she continues to feel like a mother. Her instinct that she doesn't even want to look at her own child, whom she loves the most, is actually, ironically, a motherly instinct. She is trying to protect her own child by not looking at him, right? So we see this complete lack of sense of self in her, and at the same time, when the final accident happens and the child claims her as his own mother, we see that it is as a demoness that she rather gains her motherly identity. So this play with how the demoness is not who we think she is, and when she is a woman part of the acceptable society, she is not really whom you would expect to find, that is interesting. And finally, another ironic reversal is the comparison between the husband and the wife. The character played by Chandi is someone who's doing this gravekeeping work as an ancestral duty. When she has her own child and she starts saying that, okay, now I want to leave this work behind, then actually the people in the village insist that she continue it. And one of their arguments is this, that, well, your ancestors would haunt you if you were not to continue this work. And think of all those mothers, how would they feel if the corpses of their children would just be lying around with nobody to guard them? Wouldn't they curse you for that, right? So Chandi continues to do this work as a moral pursuit. She thinks it's a moral responsibility to do that. On the other hand, like I said earlier, her husband is somebody who is in the same work, who rather looks for unclaimed bodies. So Chandi does it to accord respectability to the dead, whereas his husband's work is completely out of irreverence towards the dead, the business of unclaimed bodies. So for him, it's an occupation or a commercial pursuit. And the irony of the story is that Chandi is shunned for pursuing this as a moral pursuit, whereas her husband Gangaputa, or Narsu as his name is, he is accepted in the society. Although morally, if we were to look at morality or ethics in a vacuum out of this situation, it is Chandi who should be accepted and not the other way around. And I think this is where the movie problematizes gender also. So when looked through the prism of gender, then even a non-respectable occupation becomes acceptable, and something that involves respectability and morals becomes unacceptable or is completely shunned. So Chandi, when she becomes a demoness, what happens is, I feel something that's beautifully captured in this shot of the movie. We see here the husband and her son sitting by the lake and looking at her reflection. Now, whenever she communicates with anybody, she always communicates it through her reflection in the water, because like I said, there is a superstition that if she looks at anybody, they will be dead, right? So this shot, I think, it captures so many layers of the story so well, because the first part that it captures is how Chandi has been relegated to just being a shadow in the life of the husband and the child. Right? So this is at the very literal level of the story itself. She is simply a mirage. She's a shadow who is somewhere there in the background, but has no recognition, no acknowledgement of her contribution. That's one level of interpreting it. Another more complex level of interpreting this is to look at this image and think of how women like Chandi, or identities like these demonesses, these Lao, okay, how they become the receptacle of all the psychological others of the society. What do I mean by these? All the dark thoughts, all the dangers that society identifies, all the non-respectable thoughts that every person has in their minds, but is too conscious to acknowledge within a social circle. Okay, everything that is taboo, she's someone who embraces it all in her identity as a demoness. So it's as good as her being a receptacle of everything dark, dangerous, ominous, and sinister in the society. She embraces all the dark spaces of the society so that society can maintain its respectability and its stability, right? And here I would like to bring in another movie, a recent movie, which is Gangubai Kathiawadi. Those of us who have actually read the original story on which the movie is made, Gangubai Kathiawadi, that was published in Mafia Queens of Mumbai. In that story, there is an episode from the life of Gangubai where she argues for legalization of prostitution or sex work. And this is her argument. And she says that we are that part of the society that holds all the negativity. We are the ones who absorb all the violence. We are the ones who absorb all the lust of the society, so that other so-called respectable women can be safe in their homes and when they walk on their streets. So this is our service to the society. And this is the kind of concept, this is an aligned idea that I'm trying to discuss when I call Chandi as the socio-psychological other. So everything that the respectable society thinks, believes, but in its private spaces, not in public, is something that is cast onto this space that is inhabited by Chandi. One example I'd like to give is when Chandi's sister comes to visit her. It's played by another great actor, Mukta Barve. So when her sister comes to visit her, and the sister has a daughter, Chandi has a son. Now, when they are sitting and talking to each other by the night, her sister says that, I wish that my daughter had also died in the epidemic that is going around in the villages right now. And Chandi is shocked. She says, why would you say that? And she says that, well, because I know that being a woman, what all she'll have to suffer if she continues to survive. Now, this is something that her sister actually voices to her when they are alone. But when the sister's daughter actually dies, then the sister puts the entire blame onto Chandi and how she has these witch-like qualities and she casts her evil eye upon her daughter, etc. So this is what I mean by all the psychological others latching onto Chandi's identity. And therefore, what I see in the figure of Chandi is the concept of liminality coming into being. Liminality is this kind of border space, neither here nor there. It's on the border of where we are. Okay. So Chandi is an impossible woman. How? First of all, like I've already mentioned, she lacks a clear sense of belonging. I'll come to the second point of the slide later, which is the quintessential Zoe. I'll explain what I mean by Zoe. What Chandi does is she inherits a patriarchal occupation. Okay. Now, caste is one thing. This is her caste work. But again, caste is dictated by patriarchy, which means it is the male members of the family who will be inheriting this work. Chandi's family has no male successors, and therefore she is the one who inherits this work. So already we see her being caught up in a very impossible or not possible situation. Not possible how? Not possible according to the subject positions that the traditional caste segregation and gender segregation allows her. So there is no concept like a woman who is inheriting the caste occupation. So we see this surprise on the faces of all the villagers when this transition happens, right? So she inherits the caste, but not gender, right? Then the next transition comes when she rejects this ancestral occupation. Now, this is also unheard of because in a traditional customary society where you are born, what your forefathers did is what you will continue to do. Now, there is no sense of, no concept of modernity such as I will not do what my forefathers did and do something altogether new. That is an impossibility. But Chandi does that too. So first she's not accepted when she inherits the occupation. Then she becomes a point of taboo when she disinherits, when she dispossesses the occupation. And it is in this context that I call her an impossible woman. So I use this phrase in both ways, in the colloquial way, the way we use it, you are an impossible person. When we say that, means somebody who's not reasonable. Okay. And when I call Chandi an impossible woman, I'm talking about how she doesn't fit into the rationality of the identities available for a woman in the society which she inhabits, right? So she's constantly on this, and then given her occupation, she's on the border between life and death. And this border living gets dramatized when she has a son of her own. So we have this scene in the movie where she's feeding her own child, and that is when somebody comes from a nearby village and gives her a message that another child has died somewhere, and she must go and start making the arrangements for the burial. So there we see her dilemma taking birth, where she on one hand has the duties of burying a dead child and on the other hand nourishing life. So this managing death come life is a dilemma where she's constantly living. Therefore I call her a liminal being. Okay. And then she is finally, when she turns into a demoness, inheriting these margins of the society. Conceptually now, if we think of the margins, without margins, there cannot be any shape possible. There is no stability, there is no center if there is no margin. So unless we have identities, socially speaking, that we can relegate to the margins, we cannot have the center maintain its stability. So even after she becomes a demoness, Chandi continues to live on this borderland as the psychological other, okay, who allows the respectable society to maintain its stability, right? And even her final glory, when she gets an identity, is after her death, when she is no longer there, is when she begins to be there in a way. Why does she get glory in sacrifice? We have to think of it as how certain positions, certain identities are relegated to the margins. So these are what I call a disposable lives, okay? Lives that are not playing any central role in the society, okay? Either caste identities, gender identities, or even these psychological other identities, okay? Who are not central to the moral fabric of the society reproducing itself effectively. So they are disposable. Whether they are there today, whether they are there tomorrow or not is all right. Okay, it's not something that anybody is going to take note of. But when we think of them from the idea of the margins versus the center, we know that without disposable selves, there can be no self that is indispensable at all. There cannot be mainstream identities without the marginal identities at all. right? And that is why I call her to be the quintessential Zoe. Now, Zoe is actually a Greek word, and I'm here specifically referring to a theorist called Giorgio Agamben, who wrote the book Homo Sacer. And in that, he made a distinction between Zoe, that is bare life, life that is biological, okay, life in the private sphere, and bios, which is political life or political identity. So essentially, when we are all born, we are Zoes, bare lives. This is a very simplistic interpretation of that. So when we are born, we are all Zoes, bare lives. But the moment we are born, we immediately need to have a political identity. What I mean by that, for example, is citizenship. Where are you born? The moment you are born, you are the citizen of a certain place, right? By birth. Now, without that political identity, life is impossible in modern systems. So that is what we mean by an impossible woman, okay, who has lost her social identity, who has no political identity. And by this, I mean she has no rights, she has no privileges, she has no voice. She's just like a figure, a presence standing in the shadows, allowing those who have a voice to express themselves, to be at the foreground, right? So she is Zoe, who is neither here nor there. She is the quintessential example of this bare life, okay, who can be disposed of at any moment. So for me, this character captures liminality. And the two screenshots, I'm not going into that so that the discussion doesn't go very long, but these two screenshots depict scenes from the movie which capture this liminality. So finally, I want to come to the last part of my discussion, which is what does the adaptation add? So far, I've talked about the question of identity, the question of space, and how within Chandi we see liminality expressing itself and all the complex social issues it brings up. But MAATI is not just about the short story by Mahashweta Devi. So first of all, I want to focus on the title itself. Mahashweta Devi's story is titled Bayan, which effectively means dying. That is the translation. But Chitra Palekar's adaptation calls it MAATI. Now, MAATI in Marathi means the soil or the earth, and Mai means mother. Now, when you look at the movie, the word MAATI is problematized, okay? There are a lot of idioms which involve the word MAATI that are used. First is what you see on the screen. Mi MAATI nahi khat. MAATI khaichi, or is to accept defeat. MAATI nahi khat means I don't accept defeat. Next is porcha porichi MAATI, or MAATI keli porichi, right? So MAATI karna is to kill the child, turn something into dust or ashes, literally. And third is the idiom MAATI takli, which means to give up on something. MAATI takli is also the physical act of taking a bunch of soil and placing it on a corpse as during the burial. Okay, so when we look at all these three idiomatic usages of the word MAATI, they have negative connotations, right? Not related to defeat, related to death, and related to giving up, okay, submission. And so far, all that I have talked about with relation to gender or caste shows the presence of myths or superstitions in the society as being a negative force. But now I want to take it a step further and think of what does the exact translation of MAATI mean. If we translated MAATI exactly, it means Earth Mother. Okay. And if we look at this screenshot on the left-hand side of the movie, this is when Chandi is listening up to the walls of her hut, okay? And she feels that she can hear the voices of her ancestors telling her, why have you given up your occupational duties? Now, that is what is there in the story. But I want to bring in a new layer of interpretation and think, what if we thought of myths positively? Because there are a lot of mythologies in the society that sustain positive perceptions of gender, positive perceptions of cosmology and environment, right? So especially if we only take Hindu mythology, right? There is a lot of mythology associated with goddesses who are powerful creatures, right? Powerful entities, sorry, I shouldn't say creatures. So they are powerful entities. So they show us the positive aspects of myth, right? So if we took MAATI to be Earth Mother, I think the different titling of the adaptation pushes the movie into a different zone of interpretation. What if we looked at the character of Chandi as a metaphor for the earth itself, as a metaphor for the earth mother, and then re-look at the entire story, right? And here I would like to compare between, like, some of you might feel that, oh, maybe this is an over interpretation, and I would accept your viewpoint also, it is most welcome. But at the same time, I would like to give a bit of context of why I was pushed in this direction. So I visited the university, the tribal university in Amarkantak a while back, and that's where I saw some tribal Gond paintings. And I would like to show you one painting, which is on the right hand side, and compare it with a screenshot from the movie. Here we see this kind of fluidity in the movie. Okay. Even the grave that Nandita Das's character keeps is next to this banyan tree. Okay. And look at all these traditional stones, okay, which are worshipped by the village people as protectors of the land, right? And on the right hand side, you see this Gond painting and the fluidity and connectivity between nature, human, animal that it shows, right? So this is the worldview of the community who lives very close to nature, right? One more that I would like to show, which is the last slide of this presentation, is this painting. Look at how nature, animal, human, here even birds and aquatic creatures, they all seem to be interconnected. So this is a very quintessential Gond representation. Right? So I wanted to draw the parallels between the two and just end my presentation by keeping this idea open, that what if we were to re-look at this movie by calling MAATI MAAY an Earth Mother and thinking of this in terms of all the crimes against environment, the crimes against ecology that we are currently trying to handle, one of the biggest challenges that is facing humanity these days, and think of all the crimes against the gender or the character of this woman as the crimes against earth itself, as the crimes against environment itself, and then learn the lessons from the movie, or take the lessons from the movie as lessons regarding what should be our further approach when it comes to uh, saving, preserving, and cherishing this beautiful ecology that we are a part of, that we are born amidst. Because when Chandi dies at the end of the movie, her son gets a bravery award. But I highly doubt that if there were to be an end to the Earth Mother, there would be any inheritors present there to accept the bravery award on her behalf. And on that note, I would like to conclude my presentation, leaving the point open for discussion. And I thank you all for being such patient listeners. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Bhageshri, for that close and rich reading of the film, in which you have combined both the cinematic elements as well as the narrative elements of the film. It was a wonderful presentation. And yes, a word on your PPT, it was very aesthetically made, I should say. Thank you. Thank you very much for that. And it is now open for discussion. I was wondering, Bhageshri, what you thought of, the train, the image of the train, and the fact of this woman, Chandi, living along the train tracks. The train is often seen as a marker of modernity, but it is a comment. But at the same time, it is also a comment on how modernity is seen only as, a scientific or a technological development. And on the other hand, you have the child invoking, Ambedkar, the Constitution. So there are these two aspects of modernity that the film seems to, evoke in the minds of the viewer. And that is a comment on how modernity that should bring about a change in social relations is something that has not happened. The film keeps reinforcing that fact. And on the other hand, there is the train. So the train is there, but one form of modernity, that is the train, comes into this space of the village. But the other kind of the more substantial kind of modernity in terms of the erasure of social equities, inequities, and so on, is something that is non-existent in this space. So I thought the juxtaposition of these two, implications of modernity was also something very interesting in the film.
Yes, definitely. In fact, I feel that there's a lot more that could be said. I mean, there are a lot of complexities in the story itself, but I really did not want to go on and on. So I wanted to be selective about how much I say. So responding to your comment, definitely. In fact, I wanted to bring in Judith Butler's Giving an Account of Oneself, where she even questions the possibilities of morality created by the ideas of a rational, ethical being post Enlightenment. And she says that it is not possible. I mean, the height of morality is said to be, let's say, confession, giving an account of oneself. And this is the modern idea of ethics or morality. And she says that you cannot give an account of yourself without knowing who is this I who is giving an account of itself. And you can never know that I until you understand the social conditions under which it emerges. So I mean, why I wanted to bring this is that the choice Chandi makes towards the end is in that sense a very modern choice, in this sense that she chooses to I mean she represents ethics which have truly transcended any kind of categorization, any prejudices associated with identities like whom or whom I would not choose to help out. And on the other hand, there is this train, which is, just a very material, very, very physical expression of modernity. But when we look at the train, we would call it modern, or we would associate it with something called modernity. But when we look at Chandi, we would by no means associate her with any sense of or sort of embracing of modernity, whereas in so many of her thoughts, perceptions, her choices as a character, she displays her ability to step outside the bounds of the customary precincts of either choices or being or identity. So yes, I would even in class there is the son who says that when he reads out the essay that the Mahapurushes that he quotes, so one of them is B.R. Ambedkar, but then in his lived reality, I think in the last act, probably one could say that he embraces that to some extent when he chooses to identify or acknowledge his mother when everyone else is silent. So yeah, that little voice at the end, probably.
Yeah. Any more comments, questions? There are some comments in the chat box. Naina Trivedi says, thank you, Bhageshri, for introducing yet another way of looking at the movie. Then Dirgha Nanavati says, truly insightful and thought-provoking presentation. Thank you, Bhageshri, ma'am. And Purahan Dave, thank you, Bhageshri, for drawing the many similes for the title and giving food for thought.
Thank you for the wonderful comments. I think we do have some students from the department here, and I wish they would also voice their ideas if they wish to.
Yeah, Nikhila, would you like to?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Bhageshri, thanks for the elaborate discussion of the film. I was thinking of a couple of things. One is, in the short story, in Mahashweta Devi's short story, for instance, this entire death of the child is finished off in a line, so to speak. Whereas this is set up in a much more melodramatic way in the film. There is an actual confrontation. And as you said, it adds a particular layer of interpretation. The way I see it is that for one, I think in the short story, she is the husband's sister, whereas here, I don't know if she's a sister or a childhood friend. And this entire building up of a kind of bond with her daughter, which acts as a kind of plot device, which explains why she doesn't want to let her go or feed the dead child. I thought that was quite interesting. I mean, what a film chooses to visualize, something that is, possibly not elaborated. Here, the film chooses to narrate that, and in that sense, make the plot somewhat more cohesive, I thought. Secondly, what is for me again interesting in this process of making her into a Bayan is I think when the woman when Chandi here refuses her caste occupation, this is also a way of ostracizing someone who now does not have a caste. So turning her into a Bayan is a way of treating her as casteless, because that is the only social identity, that allows you to stay in the village, have a husband, have a son. So the moment she refuses that, so what for me was extremely searing, which comes across in a very searing fashion in the film. And I don't remember if, I felt this about the short story, but in the film, what comes across very strongly is that it is her refusal, to continue with her caste occupation that ultimately, because she's doing this, she's saying, I won't do it. And then she's called upon to do it. And then once she does not take it up, then there is as if there is no other role for her left. And the only thing is to kind of ostracize her. So I thought caste is foregrounded in a way in the film that I don't remember the short story doing, or maybe it is. I'm not very sure about that. And your reading of Earth Mother, I thought, what to me, again, I mean, if you look at all those mothers in cinema and this entire mother sentiment, that kind of gets, I mean, there are genres of films woven around this mother sentiment in cinema. I thought this film as Earth Mother is also kind of pitting itself against all these idealized mothers placed on a pedestal. Here, I mean, those who don't need to be, named or declared as such. So, as you said, I mean, it is taken for granted, as it were. Whereas here, the son's last act of naming her as his mother, even after her death, kind of recuperates her identity. And I thought that's why the Earth Mother, I mean, in the sense, someone who is not this model ideal mother, but someone of the earth, someone whose identity is probably more ephemeral, can crumble easily, rather than made of solid substance, I thought. So, but anyway, these are my readings, and thanks for asking us to watch this film. It had somehow not appeared on my radar at all. So I'm really glad that I watched this film.
Thank you, Nikhila. Would you like to respond, Bhageshri, or would you like to take more questions, comments?
Anything is fine. I would like to respond if there aren't other
please.
comments.
Yeah, no, you may respond. Thank you.
Yeah. So as I think I completely second, ma'am, what you just said. And exactly, I was also thinking of this transition in the movie where in the beginning you see her as such a confident and fearless woman. And it is only later when she starts thinking of leaving her profession that she starts, or when she has a child, that she starts speaking of this inexplicable fear that she's experiencing, and that fear only increases with time. And later, when she actually gives up the profession, we see her experiences this psychosis, which is inspired by guilt. And I had a very similar response to that, that I believe that how we can look at this fear and guilt is actually the fear and guilt of leaving behind your caste position. So this is a social identity which is so deeply ingrained in, you know, her sense of personal morality, as it is not just for her but for every single one of us who inhabits society, that it's the society ostracizes her later, or it accosts her later, but it is her own conscience or her own you know uh, inner perceptions, precepts about what she should be doing that inspire her with so much fear and guilt. And I feel the same, that it is the fear and guilt of pushing the boundaries of social categories, which are dramatized in her psychosis. But thank you for the wonderful response. I think we have a question in the chat box. Should I read it out?
Yeah, it's from Pratiksha Patel.
Yeah.
How do you see the question of self and other in the character of Chandi as an individual in the context of modernity?
Okay, that's a loaded question. Thank you, Pratiksha. Well, first, if I understand what you mean by the context of modernity, well, okay, I think it is by modernity, if you mean the rise of the liberal individual, please correct me if I'm understanding it in the wrong way. So if by modernity, if you mean the availability of the idea of the liberal individual, the availability of equal civil or political rights to one and all, as opposed to the segregation of rights that happens in the customary caste or class-based distinctions. Okay, that's a yes. All right. So I would say that self and other in Chandi would be something which is complex, in the sense that when we look at her social positioning, she is this not educated, and by this I mean education in the sense of formally schooled kind of person. So she's not she's this non-educated woman living in this remote rural setting, also engaged in work which is relegated to, according to the social hierarchy, the lower rungs of the society. So it would be, I think, inaccurate to say that she herself entirely embraces the idea of that freedom and or the free liberal self who is not bound by any of the expectations that come with her caste or gender position. But I would say that to a great extent you see her self embracing that in the beginning. That is, in terms of, first of all, we see her comfort with death, her comfort with ideas of dangers, and I think those are metaphors of her comfort with basically the darker aspects of the human experience. And we can see that because she is so close to those darker aspects, she probably processes them with much more, I would say, um, with a much different approach as compared to those around her who still approach these aspects through the social lens or filters that are associated with them. right? So that is why that scene where she calls everybody Adani, that was important for me. And like I was talking about the ironic reversals, I think when she is identified as this demonic woman is actually the moment when we see her coming closer to the idea of the traditional, customary, very delimited self, somebody, because the moment where her husband announces her identity, that he says Maji baiko lawa hai, my wife is a demoness, I pronounce this to the village. Till then, the entire village says that, but Chandi never accepts it. But when her husband says it, that is the turning point. That is the moment of self-acceptance of that. And when she starts her self-identification into that position is when we rather see her character weakening. So, when we see her being subservient to all the ideas and restrictions around the idea of being a demoness being accepted by her. So I believe this is how I see the question of self and other. Of course, the idea of the self other, it's quite vast and complex. Maybe I have touched upon only a few aspects, but I hope I have in some capacity answered your question.
Thank you. Any other questions, comments? No more questions, comments? Madhurima, Tarkeshwar, Sanjay, any questions, comments?
Yeah, I'll speak after 5 minutes.
Okay,
Geeta.
sure.
Yeah, just few minutes.
Sure. Would anyone like to come in the meanwhile, before Sanjay comes in?
So until then, if I can say something.
Yeah, please.
I hope I'm not saying a lot.
No, that's fine. Please go ahead.
So until then, I just wanted to put this thought out that it would be interesting to compare the idea of a witch or a Diane in this movie with another recent movie that has come in, a Bengali movie called Bulbul. I don't know if anybody here has watched it already.
We had discussed it also in TFO.
Oh, okay. So I think it might be interesting to compare the idea of the demoness in the two.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, Sanjay.
Yes. So I have a couple of points. First one is regarding the adaptation, about which I think most of you have already talked. Still, like you can see the name of Malinder, which is used in the film, in the short story of MAATI Devi, then changes into Narasimha. And in the short story of Mahashweta Devi in Bayan, there is a kind of effort to construct and to give the full meaning of Bayan to the readers. So I found that those lines are written in italics. So I don't know how they were written in Bengali, but I of course read it in English translation. And if the translator has been like very faithful to the original, then they might have adapted to signify that these are the lines which are describing the Bayan. So it's like a full, when we have demonology, or that who is a Bayan, okay, and what are the characteristics. They are all very defined in the short story of Mahashweta Devi. So, for example, and that also comes to, to your question of comparing which, sometimes in the Western concept, there is this famous book written by French historian Jules Michelet. It's called The Witch. The literal translation from French, but in English it has some different title. Okay, so The Witch. Then in that context, Michelet says that it was a kind of revolt against feudalism, and he says, for example, in those days when men were not there, they had gone to the battlefield, and the women were alone. They used to roam around in the field, and they used to talk to themselves. And these were the women. That was one aspect. Another was that they were against the Roman Catholic religion. So they had different kinds of practices. So they were kind of pagans, like païens, the French people used to call them, those who did not subscribe to the established religious practices. So those were the witches. But Bayans are different. So as Mahashweta Devi depict them, there are some stark differences. So for example, you can't kill a Dayan. That's very interesting. You can't kill a Bayan. That's very interesting, because you can kill a witch. The witches are burnt. Okay, Bayans are not burnt. Okay, you can't kill them, because she says explicitly that if you kill a Bayan, then your child will die. Okay, these are very interesting aspects. And Bayan, you can't look in the eyes of Bayan, as this is also depicted in the film, that you have to avoid her sight. Bayan should not eat too much. Mahashweta Devi says that, okay. And you can see in the film that, of course, some portion of food is provided to her by her husband, Narsu or Narsimham. And then she is complaining because that was eaten by dog, and then she could not eat. So that has been highlighted. And you can't talk to Bayans also. Okay, so that's also, these are very, and another one of the most interesting aspects of Bayan is that you can't ill-treat a Bayan's son. So here she is a stepmother. And in the short story, there are 2-3 paragraphs about the stepmother, whose name is Jashi, I think. And so this stepmother, she doesn't have any affection for the child, for Bhagirath. But at the same time, she's scared that she should not appear as a cruel mother and who is discriminating against this child, because otherwise she'll be punished. So she's also scared. In the film, it is shown that, because you can see that she's addressing the child as ladke, something like boy, not with the name or some affection. No. So it's like very indifferent. But at the same time, she has to take care of the son, the stepson. Otherwise, Bayan will punish her. And there is a character which has been created in the film called Tulsa, that girl, little girl, with whom Bhagirath is discussing, and through which we come to know that what is he's learning in school. She says that, smart boy, you are learning something. And there is a discussion that how she was, Bhagirath realizes that, and that he shares with the girl, with his friend, that that she was a human being before being a Bayan. So that somehow attracts the attention of the reader of the viewers to the fact that Bayan is a construct. So the film is first of all constructing throughout the narrative. There is a construction of Bayan, as you rightly said, that's naming also, that everyone calls her Bayan, Bayan, and the husband also finally declares Bayan, repetition of the word Bayan. So there is a construction of Bayan in the film, and there is deconstruction, because there is nothing supernatural about her. That's a very interesting, as you are also comparing with Bulbul, that in Bulbul there are so many supernatural aspects also. Here there is nothing supernatural I found, because everything is, materialistic. Everything is the kind of reality which we see around us. There is no what we call the element of marvelous or fantastic, like we say, as Todorov, I think, would define. But here, when she is trying to remove the logs from the railway track, she is not able to do that. She is not able to use her supernatural powers as any other, witch or demoness or Bayan would have done. So the fact is that she is not a Bayan. Okay, she has been made into a Bayan. Okay, so the film is trying to first of all show the process of construction, the process of labeling, that how a person is labeled first, and that becomes the identity of that person, and then deconstructing that look that she was a human being, like, very, with the help of very innocent conversations, though finally the girl tries to convince him that you are smart but you are not completely right. So but the message is passed on to the audience, to the viewers. So in a way that is a very engrossing aspect of the film. Yeah, I think that's all. I think, yeah, school scene is also interesting, which is not at all there in the short story of Mahashweta Devi. So we are trying to establish and all that, Gandhi, Ambedkar, and all these things, untouchability, constitution, all these things are not there in the short story, but it's a nice attempt to show certain things in a context with in a different medium. And overall, I found the film engrossing. I didn't find at any place in the film that I got bored or it was dragging or something, but I found really very interesting. And also particular camera handling, which I liked at a place where she's narrating the story of Harishchandra, saying that there are like 3-4 children, and I really loved that camera movement. From the right, it goes to the left, and it is the same place. So again, there is no attempt to create another space. It is the same space. From right, the camera, there is a panning, and then it goes to the left, and then the king, first of all, that her father is there, that conversation is going on, and then she, again, the camera focuses on the right side. Again, she can move. She can go to the stories. She can go to the past. Again, she moves to the, she is not talking to any of the characters in the past, but she is standing there. Her father is standing, and she goes there and she comes back. That's beautiful. I will really appreciate that kind of innovative camera movement, which reminds me of certain camera movements of François Truffaut. That when you are showing the passage of time, or when we are going back to the past and again coming back to the present. So, and thank you very much. And that was really a wonderful presentation, I must say. I do not say it for all the presentations on every Saturday, but this was really nice and really appreciated. It was very elaborate and very scholarly also at the same time. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sanjay, for your really insightful perspectives as always. Any more comments, questions?
Sorry, Geeta, there was one question I wanted to ask you. I didn't understand this. Ganga Putta, why does she call him Ganga Putta? What is that connection?
Because there is a historical significance to that, because the community of these grave diggers and grave keepers, they are known as domes in the eastern parts and also in parts of Benares. And they are supposed to have migrated to the Vidarbha region in Maharashtra from Benares. And that is why they were referred to as Ganga Puttas in Vidarbha. That's what I read somewhere. Maybe Bhageshri will be able to give a better explanation.
No, I agree. I think it's the same. It is a sort of traditional community name that has, if I'm not wrong, there is some kind of a similar mention in the story as well of this, but I'm not sure. I'll have to check. But yeah, I think that is the reason. It is a kind of family name. Yeah.
No, it's a caste name. The dome.
Okay, caste name. Yeah.
It's a caste name. And some of them were supposed to have migrated to Vidarbha. That is why even the landscape in the opening scene, is that dry, rocky kind of landscape, which is similar to the landscape found in the Vidarbha region of Maharashtra.
Yes. Even the language.
Even the dialect, yes.
Yes,
even the dialect, yes. It was not, the Puneri Marathi.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. No more questions. Yes, Tarkeshwar, please go ahead.
Yeah. These to join the discussion on tradition, modernity, and identity. The confrontation between tradition and modernity that we see is quite problematic in the sense that in the context of modernity, yes, we are supposed to not to have the collective identities because of the individualization process. But what we see, not just in this film, everywhere, is that in the context of India, in the context of modernity, new identities getting shaped, which have affinity or the basis as caste. Here I'm making a distinction between caste identity and caste-based modern identities. And in fact, the anti-caste movements in the context of modernity too have caste basis. Again, look at this caste of the grave diggers or grave keepers or the protectors of earth, however you want to call them in English. They are also harking back on certain mythical past of Harishchandra and drawing a certain kind of identity from it and holding on to it. In fact, widely relating that to others, that we are the ancestors of this particular people who are mentioned in this great story. But again, yes, it is necessary to have certain kind of pride and construct an identity around it in a socially hostile society. Otherwise, it's very difficult to live. But at the same time, this going back to past and then drawing sustenance from there to construct an identity will also have its negative impact. Somehow you can't leave that easily. You want to leave that, you want to escape that profession through education and acquiring new positions, new spaces that are being created in the modern institutions. But it is not easy to leave that old space. But it is also necessary to hold on to that identity for a kind of collective thing. That's where caste as identity, even individual identity in the modern context, becomes important. So this oscillation between going back to pre-modern collective entities to sustain a modern identity, even to question caste hierarchy, is something that we witness in the context of modernity. So in fact, what I'm trying to say is that this construction of the mythical past can happen only in the modern context. So in that sense, what we call as tradition is a construction in the context of modernity. So this dialectic that certain things are named as tradition and then reimposed only in the context of modernity. Otherwise, they are simply past, or memory, or some written text. But making it as past and making it as a kind of foundation for the identity could happen only in the context of modern space. So this dialectic is also important. And what comes as the markers of modernity in the film is also quite interesting. One is there is a discourse of modernity, which is coming clearly through the discourse in the textbook in the school, or the written documents. And then the modernity as certain institutions, the government office and the school, etc. And then the modernity as the modernization, the train and other things. So these, all the three, how do they represent and how they are woven together in this narrative is also quite interesting to look at, I would say. These are only the few things that I wanted to say at this point. Thank you for asking us to watch this movie, and also a presentation that try to bring out many of these issues for the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Tarkeshwar. Would you like to respond, Bhageshri?
Yes, I mean, for both the comments at the end, Sanjay sir and Mr. Tarakeshwar, thank you so much for them. One was on the technical aspects, which, as I am not an expert with film studies, I was really glad to have. And even this other by Mr. Tarakeshwar was very insightful. I wonder if you would agree with me if, to summarize what you said, we could consider tradition to be the other, to be modernity's other, without which modernity couldn't come into existence, because as we all know, modernity needs to create those binaries and needs to cast all its others into the outside its linear time in order to make what it offers, in order to name it as modern. So definitely, I mean, the question that you raised is very pertinent, and there are no easy answers, I would say, to that. For sure.
Thank you. Any more questions, comments? Yeah, Madhurima?
Yeah, actually, it was a very interesting discussion. So I did not want to comment in the beginning. So the only thing that I want to say is there are many translational differences in the original text written by Mahashweta Devi, in the translation that is done by probably Mahua Chakrabarti, if I am getting it right, and in the film. So if you see the English translation, probably most of us have read the English translation only. The English translation, there are two translations. One is its adaptation into a play that is by Shomik Bandyopadhyay. I don't have access to that for the time being. So I've read only the translation as a short story. So if you see in that translation, the way Malindar's emotions are portrayed, those emotions are never there in Mahashweta's writing. So like when in the beginning of the film, so when Malinder throws the stone at Chandi, so in that translation, it is shown that he instantly has some sort of repercussion, some sort of guilt feelings because he has done it. But it is never there in Mahashweta's story, or it is not even there in the film also. So there are some added layers in the English translation. And the other thing is that, yes, probably Bhagyashree ma'am was saying it in the beginning, like how Malindar's emotions get changed, like how he starts feeling for Chandi. That is never there in the film. The thing is how the way Chandi, Malinder declares Chandi as the Bayan, it is very interesting to see in the film because it is not presented at all in Mahashweta's or even in the translated text, because it is more like Malinder's reinforcement of his own masculinity, that he declares Chandi as the Bayan. And so I think the guilt has always been there. There was a scene in the film that when the boy, that is Gangadhar, asks, no, not Gangadhar, it is Bhagirath, asks the father that who makes a woman a Bayan. And the father was surprised. If you see the emotions on his face, it shows that he knows that it is himself and the society that has made Chandi the Bayan. So that is interesting to see in the film because it is never there in Mahashweta's story. And the ending is very interesting because in the film and also in the English translation, it is pronounced by the son that my mother was never a Bayan. She was always a human being. But in Mahashweta's text, it never comes up. He only says that Chandidashi probably, yes, Chandidashi was my mother and my father is this. So no one even declares that her mother was a Bayan. So when Chandi performs this task, it is as if this association with Bayan is already removed. And also in the both in the translated text and the original text, there was a scene when someone else in those group of people, in the last scene, someone says that, yes, she is one of us. But in this film, that never happens. In this film, only the son comes up to say that, yes, she is my mother and she has always been a human being. Yeah, that is all I have to say. Those are the differences that I found in the translations. Yeah, and thank you, ma'am, for your presentation. Your presentation was really interesting.
Thank you, Madhurima. Okay, if there are no more questions, comments, we will end this session here. Thank you very much, Bhagyashree, for your for leading this discussion. And as you have seen, so many issues have been opened up by those who spoke. So it was a wonderful presentation. Thank you and good night, everybody. Have a nice Sunday. Good night.
Thank you so much, everyone, and look forward to future discussions.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone. See you next week.
Good night.
Most welcome. Yeah. Okay. Good night.